slavery at the time of the American Revolution. We'll discuss that when we come right back. Welcome back. With me today is Mr. Paul Ford. Hi, Paul.
How are you today, Alan?
I'm doing fine, and yourself?
Fantastic.
Great. The topic of today will be slavery at the time of the American Revolution.
All right.
Could you give us a little bit of historical background on that?
Well, we know that there were slaves who had fought with the British and slaves that had fought with the revolutionaries. Some of those slaves went eventually to Nova Scotia, and there was a big debate on policies of the British Empire and the slave owner founding fathers. And there's a big debate on what would have happened to African Americans if they had sided with the British.
Well, personally, I believe, I wholeheartedly believe that American blacks would have been much better off had we sided with the British. And I think it would have made the white Americans, lose. Not that the British were that much better than the white slave owners, but there was no slavery, in English land. So, for that sake alone, I think we would have been better off. So.
Well, I'm not thoroughly familiar with the literature. There's new literature out on re-examining the real policies of the founding fathers and the British Empire, and a re-examination of what really actually happened and what would have been the fate of black Americans or the slaves if the British had won. But you still have to look at this in the context of the international slave trade and the emerging colonies and imperial powers of Britain.
But it was in fact blacks who sold most of the blacks into slavery. The whites participated in the slave trade at the coast, and the blacks were actually the ones that went incontinent in trapping their brothers and sisters and bringing them to the coast to be enslaved. So you can't really say that you can't blame it all on whites.
Yes, you can. For example, in a nutshell, the blacks that were selling those slaves, they had no idea that those slaves were going to be treated the way they were. No. Okay. But we're getting off a tangent. We're getting into a tangent and not dealing with the context, because you have to see things with respect to what was going on the American continent. First of all, examine the fact that the slave trade wasn't officially ended until 1807.
Right.
This is long after the American Republic was established. So we don't know what would have happened to the slave trade if the British had won that war, if they had continued to import more slaves or not. So we don't know that. Second of all, this was a battle between slave owners and the British Empire. Now, the slave owners, the founding fathers, had the option of condemning slavery in the Constitution, and it was 2 Supreme Court justices that decided to convince them not to condemn it because slavery was, in their words, an economic issue, not a moral issue.
But then how come, so then I read, as a matter of history,
yes,
that there was a black president before George Washington, that the first president of the United States was actually black, and that he was supported by Washington and voted in, and this was before, this was when the Articles of Confederation were in place. And so, as a matter of fact, when there was a rebellion by the soldiers from the American Revolution, that all the other people in the departments ran away, and that the black man stayed in town and convinced these soldiers not to revolt. So I say that to say that at the same time they could have a person of color being president, the first president of the United States, how did it go downhill? And
well, we had a black president, a 44th president, which was really nothing more than a black face on white power. The white power structure stayed the same. The seat of the country, the seat of power stayed the same. The spirit of the country stayed the same. Now, around the time of the Revolution, we had a slave-owning business. Right after the Revolution, they decided that cotton was king, and they decided with the abolishment of the slave trade, they were decided to breed slaves in the United States and create a huge cotton industry. That began the trauma of black people being enslaved.
But economically,
The issue is
for
that the
them?
British had won. This is my main point
Okay.
very quickly. If the British had won, they could have very easily made a deal with those slave owners, saying, okay, you're still part of the British Empire, but we have no need to abolish slavery. We'll bring in some more slaves, we'll enslave those black people. The power equation of enslaved black people and empowered white people, did not change. It did not change at all. And all the British Empire had to do was make deals with those owners and say, well, so the blacks would not have necessarily been better off because it was about money and profits.
That's
and the
true.
British would have said, okay, you lost the war, but we still need that industry. That means we will control that industry. You stay as a slave owner
Okay.
and keep those blacks down.
We'll be back right after this.
Hey, Drew Sadler, this is Ali Hackett. I told you I would get back to you, so here it is. Here is a portion of what happens on my show on a weekly basis. My show is called Salt, Pepper, and Memories, and I am the creator and host of the show. Now, the show is a cross between Soul Train and American Bandstand. But the twist of it is that my guest and myself, we actually cook on the show for the audience. But here's the part that you're going to be interested in.
Hey, Ali, show us your socks.
Drew, I want you to know I pay these people for that, all right? This is the part that you're talking about, where I show my socks every single week. So with this, I'm hoping that you and your staff and whoever you need to talk to will call me, we'll get on board, and we can do something together. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you. Ciao.
And we're back. Paul, I'd like to change the subject for a second and talk about slave laws.
Okay.
And how different states changed their laws from blacks at first being emancipated, such as indentured servants were, and the fact that in Virginia at one time you could actually be freed as your slave, stay in the state of Virginia, buy and own land, and various things like that. Well, by the time passed and laws passed, once you were freed, if you could be freed, because at one time by the end when the laws were passed, the master could not even free his slave. But during the times that you could free your slaves, then they made it illegal for a free slave to stay in the state of Virginia. Then they made it illegal for a black person to own land. So what I would like from you is to know how you feel about this, or how you feel about this.
Well, there are two issues here. The first one is when you said as time passes. Again, we can go back to a previous subject about systems of power, white supremacy systems of power. You can have a society where a black person buys his freedom, buys land, and lives, a free life as a free black. But if the context is most of the black people being enslaved, if the context, and this is enforced by law, this is enforced by might and power, if that's the context, then just like Tulsa, Oklahoma after slavery, and just like 12 years a slave, any white person had the power to trump up a charge on you, take you somewhere, say this is this one person, and re-enslave you.
But-
So you have black, that's one issue.
Right.
One issue is that white people still had the power to do anything to free blacks they wanted to, especially in this context where the majority of black people, being on the same classification as black, could be enslaved. But that's just one issue. It wasn't a passing of time and laws. The issue was, all this was going on in Virginia before they discovered that America could become an empire through the cotton industry. Those idyllic settings where somebody's working on a field and buys their freedom, that's fine. When the slave trade ended in 1807, and this book goes into it, The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptiste. Around the time that they decided that slavery was an economic issue, not a moral issue, right around that time, they discovered that the cotton industry could make America an empire. And since the slave trade was winding down, they came up with this idea of breeding slaves, importing them all over the country.
Right, but
so that was our trauma, and that's what happened to the majority of black people. So you didn't just have the context of black people not being free, but you all have the really free. But you have the context of now we have an industry where we're going to be breeding and shipping slaves.
But that's not actually, and I can appreciate where you're coming
Those
from.
are the facts.
No.
And that changed the entire society.
That's actually not the point that I was trying to get to, because it had to be a progression. Laws changed over a period of time. Even if it was over a period of 25 or 50 years, things got progressively worse. My question is, why? My question is, how did it go from the point that you could, in fact, buy your freedom and live on land next door to the person that once owned you, to the point that if you were free, if by chance you were free, you had to leave the state. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
because Andre, the laws did not change.
No, they did.
But then the laws changed because the economy changed. When you discover that you need massive amounts of slaves,
right,
that you can march 700 miles and create an industry with, then you don't have any more space for a free black who can buy his freedom and live in an idyllic setting next to some slave owners.
But listen,
that was one time. That changed when there was a historic moment in American history.
But this is the thing.
That changed, and that was the context.
Because Virginia was unique in that Virginia was not part of the cotton industry. Virginia was actually bigger in tobacco. And Virginia and the Carolinas were actually bigger tobacco producers. So it's odd to me.
So how did they maintain? First of all, the blacks in Virginia were the most resilient. Slavery in Virginia was horrifying, and the blacks in there were the most resilient because slavery was the harshest there. One of the states where it was the harshest. But if they were in the tobacco industry, I'm not sure about to what degree they got into the cotton industry. But if they were just in the tobacco industry and the cotton industry opened up in Georgia, in South Carolina, and all over the place, then what role would Virginia play then? Well, it would be a shipping port.
Right.
So they were still participating in slavery.
Oh no, I'm not doubting, and I'm not doubting at all.
And that's one state. You could grab slaves there and ship them down to Georgia. You can breed slaves.
And that was being sold down the river.
Slaves in Virginia and sell them to Georgia. And that was the trauma. And that was the beginning of the Black American trauma. Because that's when they would break up families. They would breed slaves, break up families, and we had to survive on that. And we survived as a collective. There was no individual survival. The only way we got through that was as a collective.
And I don't doubt.
And if that's going on, if you're in a society where you can grab any black person, breed them in any state, and ship them all over the place, think about it. What power does a free black have? That's another black in the neighborhood, but the rest of them are being enslaved. So you can say, well, if you don't act up, we'll just ship you down there too. Those laws don't mean anything. That's power. Those free blacks were under the illusion of something. I don't know what they're under the illusion of. But if you're in a society where the majority of the black people who are just like you, your same ancestry, are being shipped away and broken up and traumatized, then your free black self, your free black idyllic setting was not secure, it was precarious.
Well, it was always a precarious situation in which they lived. But in some instances, at least blacks were able to purchase their wife at some point. There are a lot of instances of blacks.
Is that why Harriet Tubman started the Underground Railroad?
No.
Her husband was a free black. He said, "Stay with me, honey, And she said no.
But
so
that's
she
the-
went and ran away, and then he remarried. And she came back and had to think about whether she was going to kill him or not.
But that's the
That means
resilience.
that free blacks, there were people, free blacks, that meant nothing to blacks who were enslaved. The majority were enslaved, so it meant nothing. Those free blacks were irrelevant to them. And the ones who were free blacks, well, we know from 12 years a slave, could be trumped up on a charge and be sent somewhere and have to win their freedom again. Most of them didn't. For every 12 years of slave stories, there's about 300 that didn't come back.
And with that, we'll be back.
Well, I left a good job in the city, working for the man every night and day. Never had I lost 1 minute of sleep, but I was worried about the thing that they might have been. Big wheels keep on turning, brown mirror keep on burning, and we're rolling, rolling, rolling on the river, and we're rolling, rolling, rolling on the river.
And we're back. So we got a little off subject during the last segment, Paul, but let's get back to it. Slavery at the time of the American Revolution. Now, when the United States became free after the Revolution, we had composed what are called the Articles of Confederation. The problem with that being that the states had more power than the federal government. There was a very weak federal government. I say all that to say the first president that the United States had was black. Not very many people know it. People probably won't believe it and think it's a conspiracy theory, but it honestly, Google it, look it up. And so my question to you is, how did it go from the point that you have a black man that was first elected president in this country to a time that it took, what, 17, 18, 19, 400, 500, 400 years till you got another black man elected again? Why did it take so long? Why did things digress to where they digressed to?
Okay. Well, I think there's a simple answer to that question. To be quite honest, even though I am a history major, I'm not familiar with that very much with that chapter of history, and I'm not familiar with that individual who existed. But assuming all of that were true, the answer is very simple. When they elected that black president, probably most of the people who elected that president were slave owners. They were part of a slave-owning economy, and in the North, they were profiting from that slave-owning economy by shipping away the goods that were made in the South. So all of them had an interest in enslaving black people. So if most of the black people are enslaved and powerless, then it is even less than a figurehead and a puppet if you decide to make a black person some head of any organization. You can make him ceremonial king of the United States of America. If most of his people are in the institution of slavery and powerless, then it's not like things changed. They didn't digress. They remained the same. They just evolved in a form of slavery. Now, when the Constitution was written, we had discussed this before, there was the issue of condemning slavery came up. Because if you're talking about freedom, rights of man, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then
and even from an economic standpoint, how could it make sense for you to actually keep someone enslaved, pay for them to eat, pay for their medical care? Because most of the time, the slaves it might have been treated by a veterinarian, but they certainly had better medical care than the whites at the time.
That's right. This is where I'm leading to. When the Constitution was supposed to be based on morals and the rights of man, like the Declaration of Independence. So the issue came up of the total hypocrisy of writing a Constitution for democracy and enslaving black people. It was two future Supreme Court justices that argued that we're going to leave slavery alone, convinced the founding fathers to leave slavery alone because slavery, in their arguments, was an economic issue and not a moral issue. Economic issue means we could make a lot of money off of these black people in our industry, more money than we allegedly put out to take care of them.
Right,
So
but my question,
the economic issue was the priority.
but my question is not so much that argument. I will give you that argument 100%.
That answers the question.
But no, it doesn't. Mine is a question of money, because it takes more money. It takes more money to raise and to feed and clothe
Obviously, it did not.
than if they were free. How could it not? If that's the only,
No, obviously, if they were free, they would have no power.
not necessarily free, and
If they were free, they have no power. I mean, the slave would toil all day long in the cotton fields, pick the cotton, separate the cotton, and out of that day's work, they would make something like hundreds of thousands of dollars taking care of that slave in that one cabin where he got some fat back and some scrubs, and they didn't get any medical care. If they got sick, they died. They were replaced.
no, not.
I mean,
A slave cost. First of all, a slave cost a lot of money.
Oh my God! I don't know where you get this research from. But
Because I've looked at I've looked at slave posters where it said "Negress for sale, $150." Now, $150 in any period of the 17, 18, or 1900s was quite a bit
She
of money.
made that money for them in 1/3 of a day.
I don't doubt that, but the fact that they're just not going to let them die, they're not unless
They
it's
can
much easier.
replace her.
So you saying that every one of them had $150 laying around, which was a substantial amount, and they would rather let their
If that slave survived for 1 year, there was enough money to buy 10 slaves. For
no,
$150.
not but okay. Obviously,
The money they made off of slavery was enormous.
Paul, and so if I have a good field hand, if I have a great field hand, and he's making me $10,000 a year on his labor, I'm not going to let him catch pneumonia and die. I'm going to send for.
You are if you can, or if you're already
Right.
if you're already in the process of breeding 10
It doesn't
more.
matter. It doesn't matter because I take those 10 and him, and that'll be 11, and so I get the more profit.
Those
Okay.
slaves were
So you-
replaceable.
I you know what?
They were replaceable, and once they decided to breed slaves and ship them, they were even more replaceable.
Okay.
It
I don't
was an
actually
enormous
know.
profit system.
It's not the
It was not an economic burden to take care of slaves.
It is.
I don't-
It is. It really is.
I can't
If you
follow you
look,
there.
because you have to look at, okay, you have to look at the profit of, let's just take a plantation, for instance.
Yes.
Okay? So, you have the maintenance and upkeep of the land, you have the cost of the crops, and you have the cost of keeping your slaves. So, yes, they might have fed them fat back, but that still cost you. They might have fed them
It was
beans,
minimal.
but it doesn't matter
Those were
what.
minimal costs in comparison to the profits they were making.
You don't understand what I'm saying. That it's in the profit and it's in the loss column. So that when you have to look at cost and profits, it's actually, if you could spend,
If your profits are $300
if you
and your
could,
costs are $1, then you have some irreplaceable
you're not,
laborers.
and it's still, if it only costs you 50 cents to keep that labor in
you
health,
replace it,
why would
you're
you not pay 50 cents
If you-
instead of paying $1?
Because you-
That's my argument.
Because
It
you've
doesn't.
already trained to treat that person as not being a human being, so you just replace them like you replace cattle,
Okay,
or you
well,
replace a donkey.
you know what? We're gonna agree to disagree,
Yes, we are.
and we're gonna leave it at that.
Okay.
It's been great that you're with us this evening. Have a good night.